Time for another board recap podcast. Dr. Smith, how are you today?
Great day. It's a gorgeous day outside. And just a few minutes ago, when I was out in the front parking lot, had a patron that stopped by. Desty is her name. She said she moved back here to Evansville about 2 years ago, but she was in the store, saw some crayons, bought out all 40 boxes, and then
Wow.
delivered them to us so we could distribute them to kids that needed some crayons. And I thought, you know what?
What a nice gesture.
Yeah, didn't know us from Adam, but just a good person doing a good thing. And I just thought how appropriate to mention that now because she'll never be in the media for doing anything like that because that's good news. And
You're right.
there's so many people in our community that do so many good things, not wanting accolades or acknowledgement. But
And you're exactly right. They don't want the
yeah,
acknowledgement. They just want to do it out of the generosity and kindness of their heart.
what a sweet lady. So
Wonderful. Well, great. Glad you
yeah,
happened to be out front to
absolutely.
witness that. That was perfect timing. So, before we jump into good news, we do have a special guest with us, Dr. Smith. He's been with us before, Dr. Carl Underwood, our assistant superintendent for all things business in the EVSC. So, Dr. Underwood, we'll get to you in just a bit for the budget information, but thank you for being with us.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Well, Dr. Smith, let's go to good news like we do with all of our recap podcasts. So we want to say a big thank you to our recent grads. These students, if you're watching on the screen, or you may have seen this at the beginning of the summer on social media, came in for podcast and talked about their school experiences and their futures, which was so enlightening. And then they also did some recordings for us that we've had all over social media leading up to the start of school, just welcoming students back and even giving them some advice. And they did a fantastic job.
They sure did. And if you're able to watch the podcast, you've got to smile just looking at the faces of our most recent grads.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt they're heading to successful futures in whatever endeavor they choose. So, and then also we did one more picture last night. We do this throughout the summer, every board meeting where we show a picture of our new teacher hires for new teacher orientation. And so last night we shared a picture of our last group to go through our HR new teacher orientation, kind of as always, a mix of brand new educators to the profession and veteran educators that we've been able to hire here in EVSC. So we know they're already off and running in their schools, and we hope they've had a great start to the school year.
And I think they have because I've seen several along the way. So
That is true. And since you said that, I'll share this. I know here we are in the second week of school, but I know you were really diligent about it. Those first few days of the school year, you actually made it to every one of our schools and programs.
sure did. I was blessed to, in 2 days, make it to every single school. And then the third day, last Wednesday, made it to all of our programs, the innovative models. So tell you what, a lot of walking. I think I looked up and tallied about 16, 17 miles in Monday and Tuesday, but I felt it. But boy, lots of smiles, lots of great things. Teachers and staff just doing what they do every day in a very unheralded type of manner, but just serving our students and our families.
And what a great way to see just how much work goes into seeing those schools open and running when you witness those, but not telling you anything you don't know. The amount of work these teachers and all of the staff put in to get those schools ready to go in those classrooms ready, it just doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
A lot of hard
And
work.
we've had a great start. In fact, I think it's probably the smoothest start in my memory.
Well, that's fantastic. Great. So kudos to everyone involved with that. Back to good news. We also handed out a July Cause for Applause Award. Steve Graining worked for the EVSC and our Supportive Services Department for 38 years. And a few weeks ago, on his last day of service to the EVSC, we surprised him with cause for applause. He was in a position where he was in and out of school offices all of the time. So he was so well known around the district. And talk about a dedicated individual.
Incredibly polite, professional.
Yes.
And I would call him a servant leader.
Yes.
Everyone that had interactions with Steve loved Steve and knew that he had our students and our staff's best interest at heart.
And so professional. Absolutely. Well said. Friday, this was an event that really was exciting. Talk about community partners. You referenced people doing things out of the good nature of their person. But Friday, in conjunction with the Million Fathers March, we had community partners, local officials coming to several of our schools, Lodge, Lincoln, GLA, AIS. I know I happened to be at Glenwood that morning, but they were just there to welcome the students. It was a festive atmosphere. Some of them had music going. They were greeting kids as they were coming in, and just a great way to celebrate the beginning of school.
And once again, if you're able to view this podcast, you will see the most recent, most famous alumnus of Glenwood Leadership Academy, and that's our own Mayor
Yes,
Stephanie Terry.
she was definitely there greeting students. So great to see that, or chief of police, and lots of other local officials. So
Yeah.
that was really a fun day. Also, EVSC, we were fortunate enough to be featured in Business View magazine. It's a national periodical that lifts up and showcases not only school districts, but local businesses, airports throughout communities in the nation. And EVSC was featured recently at talking about our commitment to continuous improvement. I know you were one of the individuals interviewed for that, but never bothers us to be able to talk about the great things going on in this school corporation.
You bet. And then on the picture there features some of our students that took advantage of the partnership we have with the University of Evansville during the summer for our summer STEM camp. It's a
Absolutely.
2-week program for high ability students, and a great time was had by all.
Yes, definitely. So we've got that posted on EVSC social media. So check that out if you haven't had a chance. And then last but not least, we had a good time last week posting pictures from all across the district of back to school photos. And I think you said it when you talked about visiting schools, just lots of smiling faces, and it's great to see that.
You bet.
Okay. And that takes us through good news. And if you would, then Dr. Smith, take us through consent
Be
items.
happy to. Let's jump right in at item 3.02, consideration of allowance of payments. For this 2-week period of time, it totaled $11,024,634.65, a pretty typical amount for this time of year. Then moving on to item 3.03, consideration approved grant proposals. So this only had one grant that was submitted for approval of the board, and this was our annual federal Title I basic grant. Item 3.03, consideration to approve change order number 1 for the Culver Family Learning Center HVAC piping upgrade project of 2024. And this is really for um, a change order that included being able to include a 55-gallon drum, and then also the installation of a valve that would really make the removal of a magnet that was put in place to collect. Really, it's a metallic chemical that was collecting the pipes and causing some corrosion. So this will aid in the cleaning of those pipes. Item 3.05, consideration approved change order number 1 for Fairlawn Elementary School classrooms flooring project of 2024. So this, as well as 3.06, was a change order for Plaza Park flooring project. Both of these really are for consideration of some leveling of floors that were unlevel that you really can't discover until you remove the previous flooring, and then also removing some tile that we actually removed. Some of our staff removed. So there is a deduct and then there is an add-on. So that resulted in 2 change orders, one at Fairlawn and one at Plaza. And then moving on to item 3.07, from time to time throughout the year, we do bring the approval of driver-owned equipment contracts to the board for their approval. And Nick's really, I think Nick's has been with us for more than 20 years. And then I know that going back to my days at Evans, that they had several contracts there. So I think this now brings their total contract up to 8. And we've really been pleased with their service the last several years. So this is just the board approving of contract driver owned equipment contracts.
And again, just to clarify, we've done this before, Dr. Smith. When it comes to school bus drivers, we have a large group of EVSC employed school bus drivers who drive for EVSC.
Correct.
Then we also do have a nice amount of contract drivers. These are individuals who actually own their school bus, and then they
Right.
contract services with us, and then together that makes up our entire driver fleet.
Correct. Yeah, and we actually have 60 driver-owned
Right.
bus drivers out there for us. So
Okay. So
appreciate
just
what they do.
yeah, just for clarification, if
Yep.
individuals were unsure about that. And then that takes us to personnel recommendations.
So item 4.01, personnel recommendations. And as I say, they are there for your perusal. So 2 things I would like to highlight. Aaron Wheeler is going to be the head baseball coach at Harrison High School. And then we're pleased to pick up Joe Herman. He was a longtime athletic director at Mater Dei. He is now going to be our assistant athletic director for elementary programs. When we talk to our elementary principals toward the end of the year and say, what are some additional things that we can do to support you? They said, we love our elementary athletics, but being a one-person shop, so our elementary schools many of them don't have or did not have an assistant principal or an athletic director. We were happy to pick up Joe and his services because now he's going to take that load off of the plate of our elementary school
And he certainly has a
principals.
lot of expertise in
Yes,
the
he does.
world of athletics, so that will be a great
Yeah.
addition to our elementary
And his
programming.
wife is currently a great teacher for us, so we're happy to have the Herman family all on board.
Most definitely. And then that takes us to an action item. We had one last night.
Yes, so action item 5.01, consideration to award the contract for the Bossy High School boiler exhaust system improvement project of 2024. This was taken to the board 2 weeks ago as an information item. And then on Monday night, it was approved by the board for Midwest Roofing and Sheet Metal for the amount of $162,800.
And then we have several information items, most of which belong to Dr. Underwood, but one, if you'll go through 6.01 with us, Dr. Smith.
Yes, I've been in corporation for quite some time, and I never knew that we had a boiler feeder. But
you've
we do.
demonstrated in this podcast, superintendents do know a lot about facility issues. So this
Yeah.
is just one more thing you've learned then.
So item 6.01 under information is consideration to award the contract for the Academy of Innovative Studies, the Boiler Feed Water Improvement Project of 2024. So we have quite a large tank that actually supplies water to our boiler systems. AIS uses all steam heat, and the feed water tank was starting to corrode at the bottom, so we are going to replace that with a brand new system. So we are looking forward for the board's approval of that in an upcoming board meeting.
Okay, great. Appreciate that information. And then that takes us to 6.02, presentation of the 2025 proposed budget. And that's where you come into the picture, Dr. Underwood. So you did a presentation last night at the meeting. And if you'd be so kind, just take us through that today. And I'm sure Dr. Smith may have some points he'd like to add to that.
Sure. So, always exciting to bring things from the Office of Business Affairs. Last night was the first look at the budget for 2025 shared with the Board of School Trustees, and we'll just kind of go through the slides here. So this first slide just brought attention to these are the funds that we're asking for the board to approve for 2025, similar as in prior years, but those funds are the Education Fund, Operations Fund, Rainy Day, and our two debt service funds, debt service regular and debt service exempt. And just inform the board that, when we are putting the budget together, we do make certain assumptions. There's some information that we don't have. One of the assumptions that we make when we look at our revenue is that our enrollment is going to remain stable. So that was one thing that we lifted to the board. This slide, we started to talk about the revenue side of the budget, and our major revenue in the Education Fund comes from our basic tuition support, and just talked a little bit about the factors that go into that grant. Basic tuition support is money that we receive for all of our students. The complexity grant that's listed there is the money that we receive for students of poverty. Talked a little bit about the academic performance grant. Those are our honors diploma tract grants. Special education grant is money we receive for students based upon exceptionality. Our career and tech ed grant is money received for students based on the course that they're taking. And we finished it up with our NESP grant, our non-English speaking grant. That's money we receive for students that do not speak English as their first language.
And one of the things I'd like to interject is we just talked about grants and the approval process that the board goes through when we bring grants to them every board meeting. This is different in that these are not what you would call a competitive grant. These are grants that are all based upon a formula. So they're driven by the number of students in the area of the academic performance grant. Then that would be factored in by the number of high school graduates from the previous year that actually completed a high school academic honors program or an academic honors technical diploma. So then there are various monies that are associated with the individuals that complete those diploma types. So it's not as though we have to apply and then we may or may not receive. This is all driven by a formula, and that's why they're called grants.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate that clarification. That does make sense. And of course, when we talk about revenue coming in, you also hear a lot of talk in the news when we have legislative sessions, budget sessions in the state of Indiana. When you talk about funding for education, that's what is connected to your revenue and what impacts these amounts, correct?
Absolutely. And we're heading into a long session this year, so we're looking for changes that'll be coming up in this spring.
Okay.
And Carl did a great job last night. Well, two things before we go on. First of all, he's always very gracious in lifting up Courtney Lieber, who's our executive director of our budget.
Right.
She does a phenomenal job. I think one of the very best in the entire state of Indiana. And then also, um, when we talk about the budget and the complexity, so we have the fiscal year, which you have to take into consideration, and that then we develop a budget for the fiscal year revenue that goes over 2 calendar years because it goes over a school year. So we've got really 3 calendars that I would say at some point in time really are competing calendars. So we have to develop a budget for the latter half of the 24-25 school year, and the state hasn't even approved a budget yet for 2025. So that's why
Some
I
people could
would.
say you're almost flying in the dark in some ways when you're making those projections, right?
You truly are. That's why we try to be pretty conservative in our
Sure.
estimates of the budget. But that's why I think it takes also a great deal of expertise and knowledge of the budgetary process, or you could really trip yourself up.
Sure. Okay. All right. If you want to continue that.
Sure. So, in talking about the formula, we attach dollar figures to the categories here just to give the board a look at what we expect revenue-wise from the state this year. The estimate is just over 183 million. And then this slide kind of brings all of our education fund revenue together and spent a little bit of time talking about this. There was a change this year. Our basic grant being 183.3 million. And then our miscellaneous state and local revenue is listed at 4 million. That's typically not that high. That category is really based upon our summer school reimbursement, but the change this year is that the state has taken over curriculum resources, and they're paying our textbook fees and sending that money to us, and we have to receipt that into the education fund.
Which
So,
is why parents now are not getting a bill as they did in the past for textbook rental.
absolutely. So it's a little bit of a change, and then that will, we get to a different slide here, will show that our expenditures are going to look a little bit different because that money coming in from textbooks or for textbooks has to be spent on textbooks.
And I think you were asked by a board member last night, does that necessarily align with the amount spent? And if I remember correctly, that answer was not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Last year, most school districts were kind of conservative, knowing that the state was going to take over the responsibility for the money. So I think people held their spend accordingly. And I don't know that that's going to be the case every year, that there's
Sure.
going to be enough revenue to cover the expense for a large adoption year.
Okay.
Talked a little bit about permissible education fund expenditures here. And the education fund really is all expenditures are things that you would associate with an education fund. Salaries for teachers, principals, counselors, and nurses, and supplies and equipment that would go for that as well. This is a pie chart breakdown of those expenditures, and this is one of those things that I lift to the board every year. We truly are a people-based organization. When you look at salaries and wages and fringes, when you total that up, year after year, it's at 98%. Albeit a little bit different this year, it's at 96%, but that's a direct result of the money for textbook resources being included in those expenses.
And if you remove those, then we're right back
We're
at
right back at
98%.
98%. Yes.
So specifically, individuals that can see the podcast, if you look at supplies for this upcoming budget, we're anticipating an expenditure of nearly $5 million. Last year, at this time when the board approved the budget for the year that we've just exited, that amount was a little over 700,000. So that I think certainly is a dramatic difference.
Sure.
As you referenced, due to the curricular materials, but it really doesn't change the amount of money that we're spending for employees when it comes to salaries and benefits. It just kind of skews the percentage.
That's right.
Okay.
So then we started to move on to the operations fund, talked about the revenue for that. It's driven primarily with local property taxes.
And again, when you think operations fund compared to previous what you were talking
It
about?
really is the expenses that go to operate a school district. So
Okay.
you think of salaries for my staff, people in the business
Okay.
office, or human resources, or supportive services. Those services that you would typically think that would just operate a school district.
Necessary, but
Salaries
not
for-
necessarily under the ceiling of the classroom itself.
Exactly. Still necessary.
Sure.
So talked about the revenue sources for that. Local revenue sources would be things for like our fee-based programs, our We Care program, our daycare program, and then education fund transfers. When we changed to the education operations fund several years ago,
When the state made us change.
It's true. When the
All
state
schools, it's not something we
Right.
just chose to do.
wasn't a decision that we made.
Sure.
When we made that change, however, expenses that were once housed within the old general fund transferred over to the operations fund, and we didn't have revenue that went to the operations fund to support that. So
Okay.
the state allows all school districts to transfer money on a quarterly basis to cover those expenses that were once funded in the general
Sure.
fund. So that's what we do on a quarterly basis, and have kept that expenditure constant for the last several years.
And can you answer this, Dr. Underwood, or you, Dr. Smith? I still hear people from time to time think they're getting confused with in the past saying, well, can't school districts just increase property taxes or have total control over that when they need more revenue? It doesn't really work like that, does it?
It really doesn't. We're held within a local growth quotient that is established at the state level. So any increases that are attributed to that are set by the state, not the taxing district.
And the same could be said for county government too.
Absolutely.
In city. There's a growth quotient that's applied to every taxing entity in the state of Indiana, and you're capped at that.
Okay.
So then dollar figures attached to the estimated revenue totaling $92 million for the operations fund. Talked a little bit about permissible expenditures, and we've already touched on that just a bit. It's everything that you would associate with operating a school district: salaries for supportive services, human resources, and the like, as well as operational expenses, utilities, insurance as well.
Okay.
A pie chart breakdown of those expenses, and again, I lift to the board year after year. Even when you look at the operations fund, the expense to operate the district, when you look at the salaries and fringes, it's 2/3 of the total expense is still on people. So truly, EVSC is a people-based organization, and that's where we put our money.
And listeners of this podcast hear you say that on a very regular basis, Dr. Smith. Whenever you go through some of the financial information, it's people that is really what our budget is supporting.
Right.
Moved on to the capital projects plan. This is still a plan that is required by the state. It's a 3-year plan that Steve Scheller and his team and supportive services put together. And it really is just a blueprint of maintaining the school district. Things like paving, roofing, those kinds of projects.
Facility
type improvements and construction are listed there. For everyone to see. It's public information. Also included in that would be things for technology. Stacy Mauser and her team, salaries and expenses can be paid for and listed there as well.
And I always think when we talk about this, it's good to lift. You talked about Steve Scheller and that team. They are so dedicated to making sure that they're keeping track of what needs to be addressed when, because when you have 40 school buildings plus a lot of additional buildings, this money doesn't go that far. So they have to have a dedicated plan in place to make sure they're addressing those needs that need to be addressed. They certainly can't just tackle everything they want at any time without that plan in place.
Limited resources do require a plan. Absolutely. Okay. This is dollar figures attached to the capital projects plan. Just the expenses that we would expect to see in the coming year. Some of those are fixed expenses. The ones that jump out to me are utilities, set at $4.6 million. That amount has been constant and set in statute, I believe, going back to when Dr. Smith was doing this.
Yes, so for nearly 20 years.
Yes. Those some of those expenses seem to remain the same. We know we spend more than that, but it is set in statute. Same thing would be for skilled labor, set at $1 million. An emergency allocation is anything unforeseen. If there would be a chiller or any other thing that would break down unforeseen, that's where that would come from.
And when those expenses exceed that, then we just have to figure that out through our process of how to cover those. We clearly don't cap utilities at a certain amount.
Right.
That's right. This is a look at our transportation funds within our operations fund. Our operating account is the budget is at $16 million. We know we will likely spend that. The bus replacement is a 5-year plan, which is a change. It used to be a 12-year plan. We put this together. That's required by the state. And based upon that plan, our bus replacement would call for about $12.5 million worth of replacement for the next school year. Definitely knowing that that's not going to be the case. If we were to receive $3 million, I think that would be more appropriate.
And again, kudos to our bus transportation office. They do an exceptional job, too, of maintaining our school buses and making sure that we're replacing buses that need to be replaced when that time comes. They have a very organized, well-thought-out plan in place as well.
Great mechanics do great work in that
Yes.
bus garage, for sure. Dollar figures attached to our replacement plan totaling just under $12.5 million. There's a provision there for fair market lease value, which allows us, that's the amount of money that we can charge to that fund and spend for our contract bus drivers. We have two unique funds within our operations fund here. We have funding that goes to the EVSC Arts Association. Our budget is set at $375,000. We will likely receive a little more than $300,000, and we pass all of that money along to that entity. As well as our Historical Society Fund. Funding goes to the Bosse Field Historical Society. That budget is also set at $375,000. All of the money that we receive will be passed along to that organization. Our debt service regular this year is set at just over $15 million. That goes to pay our common school loans as well as our general obligation bond payments. And then our debt service exempt is set at just over $16 million. That's for our referendum bond going back many, many years, which is getting close to being retired.
Yeah, when did you say that will be retired?
2030 is the scheduled date. Likely we will pay that off early in 2029.
Okay, very good.
Our rainy day fund budget is listed here. We, as a core process of the budget, we include the rainy day fund.
And how would you define that, Doctor?
It really is a fund that we have an accumulation. We have that money in our account already, the $10.9 million. We ask for the board's authority through this budget process to spend those funds, even though we don't anticipate having to do that.
And really, it's very similar to listeners of this podcast who have some emergency money set aside, correct, in case they need to use that to support their household budget and expenses.
It's just an efficient process to do it now. If we didn't include it in the budget process and we were to happen to need to spend those funds, it's about a 6-week process to get that done.
Well, and so you're really talking about appropriation. So
we are.
For listeners out there, if you have a savings account and you have an emergency and you want to spend money out of your savings account for that emergency, you technically wouldn't have permission to do so if you're in the situation as a school corporation. So that's why, along with the budget process, we do get authority to spend those funds if the need arises. So the fact that you have over $10 million in a savings account is great. But if an emergency comes up, you really can't wait 6 weeks for the Department of Local Government Finance to say, yes, you can spend those funds. There's, as Carl alluded, there's a 6-week process to get approval. So that's why it's important that I think as we go through the budgetary process that we simply seek the authority to spend those funds should the need arise.
What a great example of the nuances that with both of you and the team members we have with the expertise of a school budget. I mean, there are just a lot of things to know. What you're just describing, that's something you need to know so you don't get caught in a bind and then have to go through a delayed process.
Right.
It's a common practice, and we've done it for many, many years.
Okay.
And this slide kind of ties it all together. We have 2 columns here. We have our advertised budget in the left-hand column and our anticipated funding in the right-hand column. Use this to just lift to the board that we take the practice of advertising our budgets high, as the DLGF recommends, knowing that we're not going to receive all of that money. And I generally point the board's direction to look at the capital projects plan as an example, as well as bus replacement, knowing that our budgets are set high and we don't anticipate receiving that amount of money. And that really kind of brought all of the 2025 budget together, shared with the board. Appreciated them being able to come in last week in small groups to ask questions and take a look at this.
And really kudos to our board members because they take that seriously, don't they, Dr. Smith? Coming in small groups because that's their chance to really do a deep dive and ask questions of our team.
It is. They asked a lot of good questions. Courtney was there with me as well. And again, lifted the board how important she is as the executive director. She takes a lot of pride in putting all of this together. And we have a process over 12 months.
It's really a year-long process, isn't it?
It is a year-long process, and we take a lot of pride in it. So just lifted what the next steps would be. Follow the next board meeting will be permission to advertise, followed with a public hearing, and then finally adoption at the end of September.
Okay. And then assuming that all goes through, then that puts in place the budget moving forward.
Budget for 2025, and we'll start looking at 2026 pretty soon.
Sure.
And, you alluded to this earlier when you mentioned board members, but I think one of the things that is very different with our budget process versus, say, county council and county commissioners or city council and the mayor is that we work for the school board. The mayor doesn't work for the city council. So the mayor is responsible for developing a budget, presenting it to the city council. Then the city council then can do with it as they choose. The distinction here, once again, is that the school board employs us to carry out their wishes. So we develop a budget that is aligned to their wishes. And there are numerous examples of how our budgets have evolved over the years. When I think of the board's attending us to early literacy and wanting our scores to improve, what can we do? Well, we instituted the program with Mount St. Joseph. That certainly had budgetary implications. Now, all of our elementary schools have access to an individual trained in the science of reading, and we have very robust programs in all of our elementary schools for early literacy. That, in order to carry out the wishes of the board, that certainly had budgetary considerations. Another, I think, example of that is we have school resource officers in our schools now. That's very important to the board. So we have a budget developed to support the EVSC school resource officers that we employ that are in our buildings. And those are just two examples that may be a little bit more visible than others. But
Sure.
I just want the public to understand why is it that department chairs don't come in front of the board and then they have to justify their budgets?
You
Well,
don't see the back and forth maybe you see
right,
on news coverage of local or even state
right.
level government.
It's a very different process, and that's because structurally we're very different. The board is the elected body, and their governance then, as part of their responsibilities, is to hire out a staff to carry out their wishes. So that's why you will see a budget that is developed according to their wishes.
Yeah. Well, great information, Dr. Underwood. We appreciate you coming in actually while you're here. And if you just want to give a quick overview, 6.03, 4, 5, and 6. Normally, Dr. Smith does this, but this is something you do about every other board meeting.
Yeah, happy to. So this was a review of July month-end financials. So this slide just looks at our education and operations funds, our expense percentage, and cash balance levels. Very healthy there. Our cash summary of cash balances. This is just a listing of our current cash balance and the funds presented to the board. Our expenditure ledger, this is a breakdown of expenditures by function and object code, really is a detailed report listing all expenditures for the month. And then finally, our revenue comparison, just a snapshot of revenue in those funds compared year after year, last year compared to this year for the certain same time period.
Okay. And as we say all the time, what you just went through is all on board docs. And I do want to lift again the budget presentation. If you're listening to this podcast, you went through a slide deck at the board meeting. You just did it for this podcast purpose. But if you want to see that slide deck, you can go to board docs, and the slides, all of the figures that are on those slides are right there that anybody can check out. So again, thank you for taking the time, and thanks for your expertise. A lot of work goes into this, and you'll do a great job of it.
Appreciate the time to be here.
Okay, and I know, just to wrap it up, last night, continued business, Dr. Smith, you mentioned facility upgrades and just what a great start we've had.
Yes, the audience was, I think, privileged to see drone footage of the upgrades to our facilities.
And that's
that
on
have
social
been
media. We
taken.
posted that last
Very
week. You
good.
want to check that out.
And then also, I think this is one of the best starts, as I alluded to earlier in the podcast, in my memory of school. So appreciative of everybody and the efforts that it has taken to get us to where we are today.
Takes a team effort to pull this off, and
Certainly
things are going
does.
very well. And thanks again to all of our families, because all of our families working with our schools for the betterment of 22,000 plus students. And I know we're going to have a great school year. So thank you, as always, Dr. Smith, for talking us through this.
Thank you. Take care. God bless.